How you guys doing today? I wonder who knows what that is. I was reminiscing last night with my youth, listening to a record that had a big impact on me as a kid. They're actually really great players, and I still enjoy a lot of what Iron Maiden is about. But my wife came home and I was out here rocking out to Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. She's like, what? You know, I don't listen to much but jazz nowadays. And if I do, it's kind of like soothing, chill electronic stuff. I don't listen to a whole lot of pop, rock, any of that. If I do, I'm kind of showing my kids something. You know, it's not very common. I'll sit down here and just listen to something like that myself. I enjoyed it. You know, Revelations, Flight of Icarus, Trooper. I love Aces High and 2 Minutes to Midnight. Anyway, that's my childhood growing up in Canada. They were big, boy. But like things in America, you only have a window. And a band that stayed huge around the world fell off the map here by 1990. And of course, metal itself disappeared here. You know, the industry here, like fashion, needs to recreate new fashions constantly. So you have to do away with the old so you continue to purchase more. And so music's very disposable here, and it's hard for anything to have staying power in this country unless it's really willing to either A, adapt and conform its look as times change, you know, or they just kind of go by the wayside. Disco, punk rock, new wave, alternative, it's hair metal, then grunge. It's just everything kind of just has a moment in the sun. Everyone capitalizes on it, and sadly, unless you're one of the first real innovators, most of those imitators get forgotten real quick. And I think some of that applies to jazz, you know. But it's also, interestingly enough, why a lot of the mainstream music in this country has very little staying power, and why did so many United Kingdom bands make it here? In the list of the greatest rock bands of all time, you're talking Queen, the Beatles, Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, The Who, The Stones, you know, Black Sabbath, all those great bands, they were all British. And it's because in England, the industry was just small enough compared to the United States that those bands were allowed to do their own trajectories and be themselves. Whereas bands here, bands like Aerosmith are the exception, you know, and they went out of favor numerous times. So a band like Maiden was huge in America from 85 to 87, 88, and then falls off the map. And they're still selling out concerts in soccer stadiums in South America, and they couldn't play theater here in America in 93. You know, and they came back, and now things do get to come back because of that kind of disappearing act. But it's an interesting dynamic. So the record industry has always been something I've kind of had my eyes and ears on as a collector, seeing how they manipulate things and how they affect the outcome of things, and how divided the races were with race records versus pop, R&B, Billboard stuff, and how the British kids heard the black race records and started doing that black music in England. And white Americans like, oh, we love these Beatles and Stones guys, Herman's Hermits and the whole British wave doing black music. You know, it is what it is. But here we are, July, whatever the heck it is, late July 2020. What a year it's been. It's some of this is exhausting, just the constant. Every time you have a little tummy ache, did I get infected? You know, you're always kind of on that little back burner. My wife's always out and doing stuff with the homeless community. It's exhausting. So I'm glad I have this escape with you guys, and keep us in your thoughts and prayers. My wife's doing yeoman's work. You know, it's tough stuff she's doing. Number 70, Ernie Wilkins. And Ernie Wilkins is a great guy, great history, great player, but he ends up taking kind of an arranger-composer path eventually. He's born July 20th, 1919. He plays sax. He's a conductor, an arranger, a composer. He's born in St. Louis. He starts off early age with the Earl Hines group. He played with Count Basie from 51 to 55. He left to become more of a full-time arranger. In doing so, he's making stuff for Tommy Dorsey, Harry James, Dizzy Gillespie. He's a musical director on albums for Cannonball Adderley, Dinah Washington, Oscar Peterson, and Buddy Rich. He's, like I said, he's a great player, but his playing gets put on the back burner some so he can focus on arranging. And on this record here, 5 Trumpets on Savoy, he's actually doing more arranging than playing. And the 5 Trumpets on this, he's not one of them. He's a sax player, but he wants to arrange for 5 trumpets. And the great Joe Wilder, a really unheralded, brilliant player who I love, great tone, like a Charlie Shavers, Ernie Royal, Donald Byrd, Idris Suleiman, Ray Copeland, Hank Jones, Ernie Wilkins, and Kenny Clark. It's a great Savoy session, some great talent. Most of the tracks have 2, maybe 3 of the trumpet players on them. So he's just kind of using different guys at different times. I think there might be an ensemble piece where they're all on it, but certainly a wall of great talent right there. Big fan of Ernie Wilkins. He ends up going to Copenhagen, and he forms a group over there called the Almost Big Band. And he spends quite a bit of time in Denmark. That Almost Big Band, he gets Kenny Drew and Eddie Thigpen are both living over there. There's this great Danish sax player by the name of Jesper Thilo. I'm not sure how you say it. I guess he's a fantastic player. I'm not really sure of him. He's thought of so highly in Denmark that they name a street after him in Copenhagen. And I guess it's just called Wilkins, Ernie Wilkins Street, Ernie Wilkins Avenue. They showed me the Danish. So this is also on Savoy. And like Savoys like to do, these are the same record, 12022. If you're not careful, you'll buy the same thing. Always know black and white. It's going to be the first cover, first pressing. And then this one was when they decided to do a little more color in their pressings, they changed the covers. Ernie Wilkins, Frank West, Jerome Richardson, Hank Jones, Eddie Jones, and Kenny Clark. Some great talent on this record as well. I've always enjoyed listening to this one. And we'll see Jerome Richardson and Frank West coming up on our list. Great stuff. So his stuff on Savoy is pretty important stuff. He's there with a lot of the change makers going on at Savoy at that time as things were going on. Speaking of Savoy, our next artist is a guy by the name of Frank Foster. And Foster is another Count Basie lineage guy that so many of these sax players seem to be. Frank Foster, number 69. He was born September 23rd, 1928 in Cincinnati, a place we haven't got too many guys from at this point. He's a tenor, soprano, flute. He's also an arranger and a composer. In 53, he joins Count Basie. He composes the song Shiny Stockings, one of Basie's biggest songs. He does some composing and arranging for Basie's group for the next couple of years, and he also wants to kind of focus on that to some degree. In 70 to 72, he plays with Elvin Jones for a little while, I think when he's on Blue Note. And then 72 to 75, he's playing with the Jones Lewis group, another great group from that period. He's also on the great Elmo Hope meets the Count. Elmo Hope meets Foster. Hope meets Foster on Prestige, sorry. And that's a great little record on Prestige. It's under my Elmo Hope section. I should have grabbed it, but I didn't. In 86, he takes over Basie's band after Thad Jones quits. And he's just a real integral part of that swinging sound. Really knows how to play the blues. This is No Count, which is him leading pretty much Basie guys at a session at Savoy. I think it's probably from late 40s. maybe not. Maybe it's more current than that. 56, Basie Band. So it is a fairly current recording here with the great Frank West, Benny Powell on the trombone, great player, Henry Coker on the trombone, Kenny Burrell, Eddie Jones, and Kenny Clark. Outstanding stuff. And I don't think Kenny Clark was a Basie guy. He was just a Savoy guy. I don't think. I certainly don't know at all. Jean-Michel, did Clark play with Basie? This is Frank Foster on the Argo label, 717, probably from about 1962, I'd have to guess. February 63, so I was pretty close. This is also a great record, and again, he's bringing in guys from Basie's group. Buddy Catlett, John Young's on this, who's a great piano player. Eric Dixon, Al Aaron. This is a great Chicago-based Frank Foster. Love it. And then on Blue Note, he joins Blue Note, like I said, with Elvin Jones in 70, 72. And this record's probably from 69. Maybe 68. It's number 4,278. So it's probably 69, 68 in there somewhere. Another great session, fun record. I think Alvin's on this with them. Nope, Mickey Roker is. Mickey Roker, Bobby Cranshaw, Richard Wyans, Frank Foster, the great Garnett Brown on trombone, and Marvin Stamm on trumpet, a guy I don't know too much about. So that's some of the Frank Foster stuff I got. And again, that record with Elma Hope is also a pretty noteworthy session. Moving on to number 68. A guy who doesn't get much credit at all, who I'm a pretty big fan of. And I was just kind of thrilled to find this 10-inch. A guy with a lot of Lester Young in him. He's a fiery, bluesy, swinging guy from that era, Pete Brown. And Peter the Great. He's born on November 9th, 1906 in Baltimore. Goes to New York at some point, not too long. He's an alto player. One of the guys that kind of, after Benny Carter and Johnny Hodges, Pete Brown was a pretty in-demand alto player. He plays with John Kirby in 37, Willie the Lion Smith at times in New York. He plays with Jimmy Noon, Buster Bailey. And in the 40s, he's on 52nd Street. And he's playing in the various clubs, wherever he gets hired and gets worked. He's also does some sessions at Emersy at this point that end up on one of Emersy's endless compilation records. Emersy does more compilations than any label out there. You know, the first 100 Emersys, there's probably 15 compilation records. And so they're taking stuff from kind of current stuff from the vaults, putting them out, alto theme, trumpet theme, baritone, drums, songs for lovers. It's just endless stream. They're actually all great records with great recordings and by great artists. And a lot of times those Emersy collections go for next to nothing. And it's a great way to get to learn some of those other guys who were playing in the 40s and 50s. He plays with Joe Wilder in 54, who I just mentioned on the last last guy we talked about. He plays with Big Joe Turner in 56, champion Jack Dupree. In 57, he plays at Newport with Coleman Hawkins and Roy Eldridge, which is right here. That's a great record, number 8240. And one of the solid live Newport sessions that Norman Granz churns out. And then Pete Brown kind of disappears off the scene, from what I recall. I think he had some health issues as well. But this is a great little 10-inch on the Bethlehem record. That's got a nice driving swing to it. Does it mention the band members? It does not. Burt Goldblatt did the cover. I recommend Pete Brown if you stumble across this. It doesn't have a large body of work, but you will see his name quite pleasantly on session work. As a sideman, you'll see, oh, Pete Brown. And that's who he is, Pete Brown. Moving on. Number 67, Junior Cook. And Junior Cook's a guy from the modern era. was very much associated with Horace Silver. And a lot of those Horace Silver records from the late 50s, early 60s are fantastic hard bop, rhythm and blues based jazz that were accessible, sold well, super listenable still to this day. I can't recommend Horace Silver records enough. They are a great introduction to jazz that will never drive anybody away. And we want to focus on that. We want to focus on people liking this music. We don't want the perception to be that this music is so difficult and only for mature audiences, and you gotta be a music snob to like jazz. Bullshit. You can like the easiest, lightest stuff, and jazz got that for you. Jazz can be any kind of mood that you can imagine. Jazz has it. Like I often say, Cecil Taylor is perfect when you're trying to throw furniture down the stairs. Put some Cecil Taylor on you. You'll have some great backdrop for that. You know? Some Coleman Hawkins on Moodsville. You'll be lighting candles. You won't even know why. You'll be like, all of a sudden, like, why the fuck am I lighting this candle? Because Coleman Hawkins is playing. Moodsville. What do you think Moodsville means? Music is suggestive. If it weren't so suggestive, we wouldn't use it in film to tell half the story like we always do. I swear to God, we wouldn't know how to think or feel or what was going on in a movie half the time if we didn't have music telling us how to think and feel. Music is an informant. It gives us a clue as to the mood, what's about to happen. And I just want the perception of this music to be as broad as possible so as many people can embrace it. Love of jazz is the ultimate message here. You know what I mean? Above even race and above even the social issues which drive the music, love of jazz is what I preach. That's my message. And so if I ever come off hard on some of the free avant-garde guys, it's like, because we need to marginalize that so that the masses can embrace this music. Preach it. Got some dry air in this house right now. Fans going everywhere, air conditioner blowing on me at night. My throat's always worn out from speaking an hour plus a day. Working on this jazz journal and doing all my YouTube stuff and making this great sax series. I've been putting in 10, 12-hour days lately getting all this stuff together and trying to keep up with putting records away so the mess doesn't get infernal. You know, it's been a lot of work, but like I've said, it also keeps me occupied and distracted from the shit going on out in the world. And as far as I know, it's 1958. The music I listen to, I'm watching The Naked City, made in 1958, 1959. I'm watching a show with my wife called The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, set in 1958-59. My headspace doesn't enter 2020 very often, and whenever I do stick my head on, I'm like, I'm gonna go back in here. I like this better. If nothing else, I can make the world of 1956 a better place. I don't know what I can do with 2020, but I can make 56 better. I'm gonna try to help those cats out. The older you get, the more you feel disconnected from the world. You know, all the pop stars and TV stars or kids are like, they're not even old enough to act. Can that guy read? You know, does anybody even know how to read today? I know you don't got cursive anymore. You know, the joys of aging. It's a blast. But Junior Cook, man, great storyteller. He's perfect for Horace Silver, the perfect foil. When Horace Silver actually leaves that group with Blue Mitchell, Junior Cook stays with Blue Mitchell. They're a very compatible duo, those two. And I love Blue Mitchell a lot. One of the great trumpet players of the 60s. Has some great records on both Blue Note and Riverside. If you don't know Blue Mitchell, you need to dig that cat out. And they're also together on all the great Horace Silver records, pretty much from 58 to 64. So that's talking Pieces of Silver all the way through Song for My Father. You got pretty much Blue Mitchell, Junior Cook locking that shit down. Again, Junior Cook's born in 1934 in Pensacola, Florida. He plays with Freddie Hubbard some in the 70s. He plays with George Coleman and Elvin Jones at times. Louis Hayes, Billy Hardman, McCoy Tyner, he plays with at times. But for the most part, his career is associated with first Horace Silver and then Blue Mitchell, and he's just a guy you can't ignore. You know, he's such an important part of Horace Silver and the Blue Note sound and the Riverside sound that you have to acknowledge him. And so for me, number 67 is Junior Cook, a guy that, and again, this list is jaded by things, accessibility, and how much do I listen to it? How much have I listened to it? That to me is also an important measuring stick. I need to have a familiarity with it to really say I love it. And so the things I've listened to more, I listen to Pete Brown a lot. I listen to Pete Brown way more than I listen to Archie Shepp. And so for me, that helps inform where I'm going to place them. Because at my age, I'm almost 48 now. I'll be 48 in 2 weeks. What I listen to has impact on where I think something fits and belongs in the history of this music. A guy who's got a great story at number 66 is the great Charles Lloyd. He's a Memphis guy, and he comes up with Booker Little and some other Memphis cats. He's born March 15, 1938. He plays the tenor, he plays the flute, he plays other instruments at times. Raised around the blues, the gospel, jazz, soul music. Memphis is a really broad town, right on the Mississippi River. Cats come and go. Influences permeate Memphis. It's the next big stop past New Orleans. If you New Orleans, you'll hit a few other minor cities, but Memphis is the next big spot on the river, and then St. Louis. And Charles Lloyd is an interesting player. Got his first sax at the age of 9, influenced by Parker, Lester, Coleman Hawkins, and Duke Ellington, he claims. He's a childhood friend of Booker Little. As a teenager, those guys are playing with George Coleman and Frank Strozier, also Memphis guys. He's a sideman in Memphis for a guy by the name of Johnny Ace, Bobby Blue Bland, and B.B. King, and Howlin' Wolf. So he's embracing the R&B, jazz, blues kind of mix. In 56, he goes to L.A. He's playing in clubs with Ornette Coleman. So he's gaining some avant-garde free stuff there. Put Billy Higgins, Scott LaFaro, Don Cherry, Hayden, Charles Hayden, Eric Dolphy, Bobby Hutcherson. So he's getting the whole West Coast avant-garde coming. Because to me, the guys like Bobby Hutcherson had their own kind of West Coast avant-gardism that I really like. It's not as hard-edged as that East Coast. Cannonball Adderley in 64, he played for quite a while. And then he gets his own solo album contract finally. Oh, by the way, in 1960, he's hired to be Chico Hamilton's arranger. And he does that after, someone quit. I think it was Mingus might have quit. And he becomes the arranger for Chico Hamilton's group. And he's a big part of Chico Hamilton's Passing Through record and Man of Two Worlds. If you listen to those records, they're really great records. And Charles Lloyd's a big part of that. This Forest Flowers is his first record as a leader, and the band on here is rather insane. It's Jack DeJohnette, one of the great drummers Ken McAuliffe speaks about quite highly. I don't know him super well because I don't listen to 70s jazz as much, but I know DeJohnette's an absolute star and legend behind the kit. And then it's got the great Keith Jarrett on piano, another guy who I don't know too well, to be honest. You know, I haven't really dove into the Keith Jarrett 70s, 80s piano, jazz. I don't know what to say. Like, this is wonderful right here. But a lot of the Keith Jarrett stuff that I've sampled from that later era, it just has an open air. I just don't connect with it. It doesn't have the blues. I think that's just it. You know, it's brilliant playing. He's a fantastic player. But it's not a lot of guts. It's a lot of intricate, harmonically, melodically constructed playing that's intellectual, but not super sexual. And like we're discovering in this series of saxophones, there seems to be a gap between what's intellectual and what's sexual. And out of the sexual comes the blues, comes the swing, comes even hard bop and bebop. It's gutsy, it's melodic, it's danceable. Out of intellectualism comes the avant-garde, comes the free, comes the mathematic deconstruction of the music, trying to create something new, semi-driven by my educated ego, you know. But intellectualism and sexualism, they have separate paths and emote separate fuel, you know, and you can't really drive an intellectual vehicle on sexualism, and you can't really drive a sexual creature with intellectualism. They're two different branches of jazz, and from Jared I get more the latter, but he's still an incredible player who really impresses me every time I hear him. Cecil McBee, great bass player, along with Charles Lloyd. So you got Jeanette McBee, Jarrett, and Lloyd. It's a pretty outstanding group of young kids, up-and-comers, who have a big impact on what's left of jazz in the 70s. And it's guys like Jeanette and Jarrett that actually keep jazz selling. You know, it doesn't sell like it once did. It certainly doesn't sell to black audiences like it once did. It's definitely become marginalized to the pop masses. It's become more for intellectuals, beatniks, professors. Like who buys Keith Jarrett records? You know, it's the Europeans loved that whole era and stayed true to jazz through that whole period. But the black guts of jazz seems to go missing right around the time Curtis Mayfield starts singing People Get Ready, There's a Train A-Comin'. Right around the time Marvin Gaye starts singing What's Going On, Mercy, Mercy Me. You know, that message, that the guts, the fuel of that music moves into R&B and soul, and jazz takes on an intellectual engine. And if I'm in the mood for intellectual, these cats can blow most of the great art rock bands off the stage. Even the Grateful Dead and Pink Floyd, some of those legendary groups, you know, you listen to some of these intellectual jazz players, and it's high level virtuosity. But anyway, Charles Lloyd's an interesting guy. This record had a rock crossover aspect to it. It connected with rock and audiences and sold really well. It won Jazz LP of the Year on Downbeat. It's a great record. It really is. And what's crazy, they've been together for a year, and they're recording live at Monterey, and they kill it. They absolutely kill it. I also have this record by Charles Lloyd, A Journey Within, and most of the same group. I think the bass player is different, but I think it's still Jarrett and Jeanette, and fantastic stuff. So that's the great Charles Lloyd at number 66. So keeping this moving along here, I tend to talk a lot sometimes. Good thing I got a YouTube channel. Number 65, another Texas tenor. Another guy that's a giant. Another guy that deserves more credit than he gets is the great David Newman. And Fathead. And he was called Fathead because one of his teachers nicknamed him that for thinking outside the box a little too much. Hey, Fathead, do what you're told. Quit trying to think for yourself. I think it was his music teacher, actually. I think he was doing something deconstructive but intellectual, and the teacher wasn't having it. Newman is, of course, Fathead is of legendary importance for one reason, just primarily, and that's his contact and interaction with the great Ray Charles. And Ray Charles is an institution of music. You know, he's one of the greatest progenitors of the art forms of blues and soul and jazz and gospel, and splices it all together into a new Ray Charles formula that's really outstanding. And if you don't love Ray Charles and know his Atlantic stuff, you're missing out, because it's the essence of the black experience and overcoming, and the joy of Armstrong, the forgiveness and the swing of Armstrong. Charles embodies a lot of that same black dynamic to the white kingdom. We're going to forgive, we're going to have fun, celebrate together, and I know a woman across town. And I've said before, but Ray Charles got into some real hot water with not just the white audience, but with the black churches for taking gospel songs and secularizing them. You take a gospel melody, I have a Savior way on high that's good to me, and secularize it with an R&B groove and make it, I got a woman way across town, she good to me. Ooh! Sanctified people didn't think too highly of that. They got a little upset with Brother Ray. And we don't think of Brother Ray as being the rebellious outsider type, but people want to crucify Brother. You know, in the late 40s, early 50s, Ray was the public enemy number one. He was sexualizing gospel music. And he was also titillating white girls, which white men have a real problem with. Real problem with. So Ray was in the crosshairs very early on. And thankfully his success at Atlantic kind of propels him to enough fame that he slowly gains an acceptance, first in the black community, but then eventually in the white community. He becomes one of the great crossover success stories without ever selling out. He doesn't go Lionel Richie on us. He doesn't go Whitney Houston on us. He stays very much legitimately soul, blues-based, black, honest with his expression. Prince made music for white people. Brother Ray makes music for people. See what I'm saying? Prince is consciously making, Berry Gordy is consciously making black music for white people. Prince didn't make Little Red Corvette for brothers and sisters to dance to. That's for white people to do a little, you know, it's a conscious decision driven by money. You know, Brother Ray never made that sellout, and most of the time when you do sell out, the black community will kind of turn your back on you to some degree. Back to David Newman, born February 24, 1933 in Corsicana, Texas. I believe it's in the Dallas area, if I recall. In the 50s and 60s, he starts working with Ray Charles. He's one of the great proponents of the Texas tenor sound. And he becomes known by playing with Ray. It really brings him to the foreground. He's inspired by Louis Jordan, which is obvious. You know, he meets Ray Charles in 51, but then he actually starts playing with Ray Charles in 54 after Don Wilkerson, another great Texas tenor, moves on. Buster Smith, who we talked about a few episodes ago, actually was one of the great teachers of Fathead. And so the lineages are all so interwoven. He plays with T-Bone Walker in the late 40s for a while, another great crossover blues jazz artist. He's prolific with Brother Ray. He's there with Ray from 54 to pretty much 64. All that great Atlantic stuff on the pop and on the jazz side of things. He gets being known for the 8-bar, 12-bar solo. You know, 8 bars for Coltrane, he's just got his reed warmed up. You know, Coltrane's going to go 126 measures. You know, Coltrane's going to come, I'll be back in 10 minutes. With the constraints of the pop record, the 45 RPM, the digestibility of a R&B song, Fathead got 12 bars if he was lucky. And he made the most, each note matter. Fantastic dynamic to be able to do that. And not everybody can be that concise. But he really becomes the progenitor of that, which we see crossover into rock and roll. The great guitar solos that come along in the 70s in classic rock and the 80s in hair metal, a lot of those are 8 and 12 bar guitar riffs, solos, back to the chorus. He's a really important figure in the history of this music, and he's prolific. He works in pop, R&B, blues into the 70s and the 80s. He has a pretty good string of records here on Atlantic. This one's, of course, Fathead Ray Charles presents David Newman on Atlantic with Ray Charles, of course. Straight ahead, number 1366. This one was 1304, puts it about 1958, probably 1960. 1399, not too long after, Fathead comes on. This is called The House of David, 1489. This is Bigger and Better, 1505. And so that's 5 of his records on Atlantic, and there's a lot of other stuff that comes out on other labels, and of course he's appearing on a lot of other genres of music because of his fame with Ray. So that's David Newman. Again, one of the real definitions of the Texas tenor sound is David Newman. Fantastic player. Moving on to number 64, we have ourselves another Texas tenorman, Bud Johnson. Bud Johnson is very much in the school of Illinois Jacquet. Very much that. How perfect. See what I'm saying? That's where we want to be. Okay. Number 64, Bud Johnson, born December 14, 1910. Dallas, Texas. Drummer and piano first, and then he moves on to the saxophone. He played with Armstrong in 32 and 33. Then he played with Earl Hines in the late 30s. And then it's he and Billy Eckstein, while with Earl Father Hines' band, that convinced Earl Hines to start hiring modern jazz musicians. And it's in the rehearsals of the Earl Hines Orchestra with Billy Eckstein and Bud Johnson leading the way, where they start hiring the modern sounds of jazz that becomes bebop. That alone makes him of super high importance. He's a part of some important sessions with Coleman Hawkins in 1944. In the 1950s, he leads a group for a while. He's also working at Atlantic, making hits for Ruth Brown. Teardrop From My Eye was a big hit for Ruth Brown. Bud Johnson's playing on that. In the mid-60s, he actually goes back to Earl Hines for a while. He has records at Riverside, which is, I believe, this one, number 343, probably from 1960. I'm going to have to guess. He has a record with Gil Evans. He makes these 3 records for the Arago label in 63, 64. He's also playing with the likes of Quincy Jones, Gil Evans, Duke Ellington, Dizzy Gillespie, and Randy Weston. So a lot of these great arrangers, they want money man when they make their arrangements. They want a guy that can do the charts, play it like it's like they hear it. That's going to be countable, reliable, and Bud Johnson fits the bill for the guys like Randy Weston, Gil Evans, Dizzy Gillespie, Duke Ellington, Quincy Jones. Those guys are all composer-arranger types. So the fact that they all hired Bud Johnson tells you something about his ability. Interesting little tidbit, his grandson is the famous rapper Prodigy of one of the great East Coast first wave of great kind of, I won't call it gangster rap, but Mobb Deep. Mobb Deep is there with Nas and the Wu-Tang as that early 90s kind of philosophical hip-hop that was speaking on the streets in a new kind of way, with a new kind of raw honesty. NWA opens the door on some levels on the West Coast for that, but what they're doing is so combustible, and what the East Coast guys are doing is a little bit more cerebral, a little bit more in the lines of KRS with a new, more aggressive sound. You know, the 90s rap had a little bit more edge to it from the Wu-Tang, from Nas, from Mobb Deep. But anyway, that's his grandson. Love Bud Johnson. I need to listen to him more, honestly. Those Argo records are great, and they're just filled with great Chicago players. Number 63, a guy that's got some real avant-garde edges to him is a guy by the name of Sam Rivers. And Sam is a pretty great player. He's a pretty diverse player. He's known to most of us for filling in Lyle's chair once George Coleman departs. And then, of course, once you get the Blue Note, Sam Rivers has 4 or 5 records probably there at Blue Note that are pretty noteworthy records. This is the Fuchsia Swing Song on the Blue Note label. But he definitely doesn't start out with the edges like this. He's born September 25th, 1923, in El Reno, Oklahoma. So there's quite a few guys from Oklahoma, it turns out. He starts out by playing soprano and tenor, as well as the bass clarinet, the flute, and other instruments. He learns in church and the blues, gospel. His family was very much from a religious background, so he always had access to instruments and music, and that kind of fervent black church experience is a part of his background. And then he joins the Navy in the 40s. When he leaves the Navy, he goes out east to Boston, studies at the Conservatory of Music in Boston. In 54, as a 13-year-old, as a 15-year-old, he's playing with a 13-year-old by the name of Tony Williams. And it's actually Tony Williams in 63 who recommends Rivers to Miles. Rivers is a pretty intense cat. Like you said, he's rooted in melody, but he's also got real elements of bebop, free jazz, and eventually the avant-garde even. He goes to Miles in 64, and Miles doesn't really want to handle him. He says he's too avant-garde for Miles. Too much for me. And so he replaces him with Wayne Shorter, which is a little ironic if you ask me. I really enjoy his records here at Blue Note. He starts making records at Impulse as well that are important records of this era. We're going to look mostly at his Blue Note titles there. And then this would be the two Impulse titles that I have. And these are going to be more from the early 70s now. His Blue Note stuff doesn't start until about 64, 65, 66. So he's there for the tail end of Blue Note as an independent label. He ends up in the 70s opening a place called Studio Riviera, Riviera, some kind of play on that. It's like a loft jazz club in Lower Manhattan. And loft jazz was kind of a code word for a free jazz hangout. And so you never knew what kind of playing was going to be going on there if you were to show up. But in spite of all Rivers' edges, he's always got some of Lester Young's ability to tell a story. And for me, the Hawkins, the Lesters, the Ben Websters, those guys always are telling you a story. And all great sax players have to retain some of that. Remember, the saxophone mimics the human voice like few other horns do, like few other instruments do. And so a saxophone player should always be telling us a story. Like I said, like the Miles Tokyo record with Rivers, I think it's a pretty challenging record. And I think it's a little strange Miles fires Rivers for the avant-gardism and then hires Shorter, who's all the edges of a 17-sided dice. Like, Shorter's an interesting, complex dude, but I think Miles would fire you and hire you as much for personality reasons as anything else. Be right back. Hold on. Sorry about that. A phone call I had to take. My brother called me a few times. He usually doesn't call more than once if it's not important, and it was semi-important. Not sure it's important enough to interrupt the Jazz Shepherd stream of thought. I'm just playing, brother. My brother runs a t-shirt company in town. He needs some help doing some cleanup, so I'm going to have to bounce over there for a little bit and help him out. But let's finish this episode real quick. A guy who deserves more credit than he gets again is a guy by the name of Benny Carter. And Benny Carter has a long history in jazz. He's actually got one of the longest careers, and I think he spends enough time in Europe where he kind of gets forgotten domestically, which is a real crime. He, along with Johnny Hodges, are the real progenitors and developers of the alto saxophone. Benny Carter's a giant on the alto saxophone, and he's one of those guys that decides to go the arranger-composer route a lot, and he also was a multi-instrumentalist playing the trumpet almost exclusively for long stretches. This is some early stuff on the Everest label, and Everest was a great way to collect pre-war 78 stuff by these artists. It usually was a budget label from the 60s and 70s, and those records were pretty available in the early 90s, but even those have become kind of rare and tougher to come by. Carter's a brilliant arranger. He's got very progressive ideas. His charts are often very saxophone driven in terms of how he's approaching it. He was born in 1907, August 8th. So that puts him back at the dawn, living through the Depression, the Roaring Twenties, swing, prohibition. Carter's a part of all that. He plays clarinet, trumpet, saxophone, composer, arranger, and a great band leader. He's, like I said, a pioneer of the alto with Johnny Hodges. Early 20s, he's playing with Pops. No, he's actually writing and arranging for Fletcher Henderson. And some of Fletcher's great arrangements are done by Benny Carter. In the 20s, he's working with Earl Hines and others. In 36 to 38, he actually goes to the United Kingdom for the first time. He's working for BBC and doing things over in England. 38, he comes back to the U.S. He locks down the Savoy Ballroom for a number of years. In 45, he goes out to L.A. He's playing with guys like J.J. Johnson, Max Roach, Miles, and others. So he's a real father figure to a lot of that generation. He, in the 50s and 60s, is doing arranging for all the greats. And that's where you're going to see his name pop up in that era. For Pops, for Roy Eldridge, for Ella Fitzgerald, for Peggy Lee, Sarah Vaughan. Benny Carter's a very predominant name in the arranging of pop jazz and big brass sections, saxophone-driven arrangements. He's a guy that deserves a lot more credit than he's given. He makes a comeback in the 70s. He starts playing the saxophone a lot more again later in his career. He has a couple records on Impulse that I think are fairly noteworthy records. This is number 12 in the Impulse discography with Coleman Hawkins, Joe Jones of Basie's group, Phil Woods, Charles Rouse, Dick Katz, Jimmy Garrison, and John Collins. It's an interesting group and an interesting record. And then this is additions to further definitions. And nobody writes for saxophones with such skill and flair as Benny Carter. Stanley Dance from Jazz Magazine. And these are both important parts of the Impulse discography. And one of the things Impulse did well was recognize giants of the past that needed a little boost and a little publicity in the modern era. He makes a couple records for contemporary that actually come before the Impulse stuff from the late 50s. Jazz Giant and Swing in the 20s, playing old arrangements with a modern group. And it's really great stuff. This is a record I've had for a long time. Benny Carter, American Jazz Orchestra, Central City Sketches. I think it's from the late 60s. And again, it's arrangements. And there's some pretty good players on this, if I remember. John Lewis is musical director. Marvin Stamm, Jimmy Knepper, Eddie Burt, Bill Easley, Danny Bank, Dick Katz, Ron Carter, Mel Lewis. So yeah, some great players on this. And when was this recorded? Maybe not to the 80s even, I don't know. It looks like it might be from the 80s. I haven't listened to it in a long time, obviously. One of the things about having 13,000 records is some things do slip through the cracks. The last guy we're going to talk about, number 61. And I'm going to be honest here, I didn't know Roland Kirk was a blind man until when I did my research yesterday. I was like, really? Roland Kirk's blind? And I guess it makes sense. He's always got sunglasses on. One of those things I missed. Some people might have Roland Kirk higher on their list. This is where I got him. He's a multi-horn player simultaneously. He can play 2 and 3 horns at once. He's one of the guys that really kind of brought that to the table. And he was doing it as a young blind man, blowing the pants off people. Blowing the pants off people. Born August 7, 1935 in Columbus, Ohio. Tenor, flute, plus other instruments as well. He's known for being a character live, being humorous, on-stage banter, talking to the crowd, talking to his band. He's also known for talking about social political tirades and rants on stage, stating his frustration with the state of affairs. And jazz becomes more and more a part of that quilt in the 50s and 60s, discussing that stuff verbally, not just in that coded message of the horn. He's one of the great hidden guys that plays kind of a soul jazz bebop crossover with elements of free jazz and swing at times. He plays with guys like Quincy Mingus. He's on Roy Haynes' LP Out in the Afternoon, which is a great record, very interesting edges on that. He's also Quincy Jones' Soul Bossa Nova, which we all know from Austin Powers. You know, you can see that silly dance. Some of the great sax on there is Roland Kirk. This is a record he does for Argo in 669. It's the second record, I think, after one he does for King, which I think Bethlehem also issues. This is a record he does probably 1961 for Prestige, 7210. Roland Kirk's work with Jack McDuff. That's a really great record with a cover that's pretty hard to see. He's got the three horns at once there. He goes to Mercury after Emerson is dissolved, and he makes some really solid records at Mercury, and then he makes a long string of records for Atlantic that are some really interesting, complex, socially charged, unlike much else in a way. He has his own thing going. And this is a record for Verve from probably 1968 called Roland Kirk, Now Please Don't You Cry, Beautiful Edith. And not a particularly common thing for Verve to be doing something like that. But Verve did take chances on once in a while. Roland Kirk's kind of an underappreciated guy, but yeah, a lot of the avant-garde cats kind of find out about him. And if you like Sam Rivers, if you like Jackie McLean, Roland Kirk's going to be in that kind of same vein. A guy like George Braith is going to borrow some of that same multi-horn playing from him later on. But that's Roland Kirk. Didn't know he was blind. Should have known that. That's number 61. That wraps up this top 10. Tune in either tomorrow or the day after, where we dig into the next group. Y'all be safe on the Jazz Shepherd. Peace.